start recording and then I'll share the screen. Thank you, Edith. Boa tarde, pessoal. Nós vamos começar nossa sessão agora. Eu sou Annelise Zandonar Hoffman, sou EducationUSA Advisor e também coordenadora aqui nacional da nossa linda rede do Brasil. É um prazer ter vocês aqui, sejam bem-vindos. Vou falar um pouquinho sobre a nossa missão, o nosso papel aqui na rede, que é de promover o ensino superior nos Estados Unidos. Nós trazemos informações atualizadas, abrangentes, diretamente da fonte, diretamente das universidades americanas. Nós somos afiliados ao governo americano, ao Departamento de Estado, e no Brasil nós contamos com 40 escritórios. Esse mapa está até pequeno aqui, eu tentei colocar para vocês terem uma ideia, mas a gente tem muito orgulho da rede tão grande que nós temos de orientadores especializados, treinados e que passam as informações atualizadas para todas as pessoas que procuram por estudos nos Estados Unidos em nível superior. Vocês podem ver aqui nesse mapa que a gente está praticamente em todos os estados, né, com um centro que pode ser um centro binacional, Brasil e Estados Unidos, ou uma universidade particular, uma PUC, um Instituto Federal, ou um SENAC. Nós temos uma variedade de host institutions que nós chamamos, onde estão os nossos orientadores. Alguns estão aqui, que depois vão poder abrir suas câmeras e se apresentar também, a Areta, o Davi, que estão em escritórios nas universidades aqui no Brasil. E, como eu falei, a gente traz informações atualizadas sobre isso dos Estados Unidos. A gente usa uma metodologia chamada 5 Steps, ou seja, nós fazemos o passo a passo, a gente caminha com as pessoas em direção à concretização dos seus planos, né? Fazendo um timeline, um cronograma de um planejamento também do que a gente pretende fazer. Uma pessoa que deseja fazer uma faculdade, ou um mestrado, doutorado, que deve ser o caso de vocês aqui, porque hoje a apresentação é sobre um programa de mestrado na University of Baltimore, mas a gente procura seguir todas as etapas que fazem sentido aqui para que a pessoa, dentro de um planejamento de um tempo viável, possa ir realizando, cumprindo os requisitos exigidos por uma graduação, um mestrado ou doutorado nos Estados Unidos. Eu não vou me aprofundar aqui, mas queria apresentar a rede, falar para vocês que a gente tem muitos webinars, muita atividade online. Hoje em dia, estamos 100% virtualmente em todo o Brasil, seja com atendimentos de plantões, ou seja numa programação de webinars como essa aqui. E aqui é o nosso site e agenda de eventos, onde vocês vão localizar essa programação. Todos os dias temos alguma coisa acontecer. E aqui a melhor forma também é seguir o nosso Instagram, ou Facebook, ou site, que vocês ficam por dentro de todas as atividades. Então, eu queria agora informar, a gente vai transition into English, porque os nossos special guests aqui são da University of Baltimore, e a sessão vai ser em inglês, tá? I will transition into English to introduce Nusta Carranzo, Carranzo Co., and Jim Shea. They are both from the University of Baltimore. They will be talking about a master's degree. And if Nusta wants to share the presentation, we will have the title there, that is in Global Affairs and Human Security. And it's a very relevant topic that has everything to the moment we are right now. Thank you, Nusta. And they will share the content of this program, the requirements, and how they aim to offer a cutting-edge topic within a prestigious university such as University of Baltimore. So welcome, Nusta and Jim. The floor is yours. Feel free to talk to people here. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Annalise. Maybe before I get started, my name is Nusta Carranzo. I'm the assistant professor in the School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Baltimore. I am joined here today with my colleague, Jim. Would you like to go introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Jim Shea, and I work in the admissions office. I work specifically with the international applicants. So if any of you have questions, at the end of this, but also afterwards, if you want to communicate with us, I'll be the one that you'll be speaking to if you want to explore coming to the University of Baltimore. Thank you all for joining us today. And thank you to EducationUSA for hosting us as well.
Thank you so much. So as my colleague Jim had already mentioned, we are from the University of Baltimore. We're very excited to join you virtually today in Brazil time, 4 p.m., right? So maybe I should say boa tarde, everyone. I know, I guess I speak a little bit of Portuñol, so my apologies. Thank you so much for coming to today's talk. So today we're dealing with something that I think has been grappling everyone's minds in many different ways and very unfortunate circumstances too, which deals with COVID-19. This is a pandemic that has affected us in many different ways, personally, or perhaps even in our daily lives in terms of jobs as well. But I think it's important to look at this within the broader spectrum of looking at this as a power dynamic between developed and developing countries type of situation. And I think this is key because ultimately I think health policies and health security, which is also a part of global affairs, has become very much highlighted and emphasized these days a lot more than one would have expected or perhaps the world was prepared to handle. So these are some of the things that we're going to be discussing today. Just to reiterate what my colleague Jim had mentioned before, please use the chat function as well to list any type of questions you might have throughout the presentation. And that way we can also keep monitoring as to the types of questions you might have regarding this topic or perhaps the master's program or different programming that we also have in the College of Public Affairs and also at the University of Baltimore. So let me move on to my next slide. So this is an emerging situation from 2019. I think perhaps I don't need to explain this too much more because I think we have all personally lived this in many different ways. It was very interesting me on a personal note to see this happening because I am partly of South Korean background. And when this situation started breaking out in 2019, December in China, there were already emerging concerns happening in South Korea regarding how this was going to be dealt with. And at that moment already, I remember speaking with my colleagues about this topic matter and telling them that this is not going to be an East Asia specific situation because the world is connected very much globally. And we have, in the case of East Asia, had many instances of dealing with different types of outbreaks of different diseases, including SARS and H1N1. So we had a little bit more perhaps of an experience in looking at this situation. But already from 2019, we could tell that this was going to be something much bigger than the previous types of infectious diseases that we had, and that this is going to be something more global, especially because no country was really taking this too seriously, and the borders were still open. And we're going to talk about that a little bit further, but it became exacerbated to the extent that in March, and I remember this very specifically because I think most of my students who are also taking my courses, they said in March, everything stopped. So March 2020 becomes this marking of the year when the COVID outbreak finally, I guess, puts a sense in everybody around the world that this is something really serious and we are dealing with a very grave issue, even though it had already taken Italy by surprise and it was decimating different parts of Italy. And also China had already been on lockdown and South Korea was also dealing with this in many different ways. But I think ultimately this became an issue that became more highlighted in March. And we had many more hotspots internationally developing, including, I think in this slide, one thing that's missing is the most recent development in the last 5 days, which would now also include India, which is extremely alarming and problematic. Especially given the population size of India and what India means for the world as well. So I think it's also important to look at the varying responses to the COVID outbreak, right? And I think the responses here, at least the countries that you have on this slide, are countries that are still somewhat more equipped to deal with an outbreak such as COVID-19. And even though they were equipped to deal with it, obviously the response from the government, a lot depended upon the leadership as well. So in the case of the US and Canada, they followed the lockdown and lockdown of border model. That's basically when it's a state-by-state lockdown that took place in the US. Canada and the US border was also closed. EU travel was prevented and Brazil was placed on travel prevention. And I think that's something that at the very beginning of this webinar, we were able to address that students who will be coming to the US are actually going to be exempt from having a travel restriction coming to the US. So I think that is good news. But originally Brazil was also included in the travel hotspot. And actually, in fact, up until about 3 weeks ago, Canada, particularly Ontario, was also recommended by the CDC as a no travel zone as well. So a little bit of perhaps more focus-based lockdowns or recommendations of no travel type of policy was being implemented. Canada had kind of a similar response, where it was a Canada-US border being closed, city by city and province-based lockdown. So in hotspots at the very beginning of the pandemic, in cases like Montreal, there were a major lockdown in the city of Montreal. There was a very significant and stringent measures of trying to make people stay home, right? Hashtag stay home. That was the thing that was trending at that time. And right now what Canada is doing is because they have such a great outbreak regarding the variants that have come over to Canada. They have been much more strict in terms of putting a quarantine measure for travelers coming into Canada, where if you travel by air, even if you are vaccinated and you're coming from a country after being vaccinated and after testing negative for COVID, you still have to be quarantined in a government designated hotel for 2 days at your own expense, and then also go through the testing and the quarantine period, which is mandatory for 14 days, and report every day to the government as to your temperature and things like that. But that model of reporting to the government as to your temperature, that's actually a very standard model that takes place throughout many different other countries that have also instituted quarantine measures. So that's also not too significantly different, perhaps, if you will, compared to other countries. So Canada, US, kind of models that other countries are also emulating. In the case of China and South Korea, I would call this a lockdown of border and semi-lockdown of hotspot cities. And lockdown of border here, I think, is unique because in the case of South Korea, they actually imposed a no lockdown of air travel. And to this day, I think it's the only country in the world that has not imposed any type of lockdown on air travel. And the way that they were able to contain the situation initially was what they called K-infection prevention, which basically had to do with lots of developments of digitalized tracking over the phone as to where the people that were infected were. If by any chance you had crossed paths with anyone that had been infected, you would get an alert on your phone that would basically recommend you to stay home or get tested. And massive testing was available anywhere around the city of Seoul, including also different parts of South Korea. And there was a lockdown in the city of Daegu where the biggest outbreak had occurred based on a religious cult that had basically gone against the restrictions of the government in terms of recommending religious services to not continue for over more than 100 people gathered together. But that happened, this was at the very beginning of the pandemic. And so things got a little bit out of control in the city of Daegu, but they were able to lock down the city. So that's the one city emphasis that they made in locking down, which was very similar to the case of China, except the lockdown of Wuhan was a lot more stringent in terms of the measures that they used, where the military was heavily involved. So even though you have democratic countries going through a lockdown, you don't actually see this being enforced, perhaps in terms of the usage of the military or security forces. That's the type of thing that you got to see in China. And some scholars have actually commended that aspect of authoritarianism as having been able to prevent further types of infections from getting out. But I think that is something that only history, I think, will be able to judge in the future, because authoritarianism, one way or the other, is not anything too exciting or recommended in any democratic types of settings. Now, countries that emerged victoriously, but I think has not been or have not been getting too much attention are Taiwan and New Zealand. And I think I want to emphasize on the case of Taiwan. Primarily, the reason why we don't hear too much about Taiwan, and I think this is also related to the power dynamics, coming out from the COVID outbreak, is the fact that Taiwan is not recognized as a country by China. It's considered to be a part of China. So there is that political aspect that is making it more difficult for the Taiwanese model. That is actually really one of the best models of countries that emerged victoriously from this period to be emphasized a lot more than the attention that it actually should be getting. And so in the case of Taiwan, very extensive public health infrastructure pre-COVID-19, they were already again prepared because of SARS and H1N1 and MERS. So most of the East Asian countries were perhaps more prepared because they have had these infectious diseases, outbreaks also impacting them one way or the other. In terms of Taiwan, there was a heavy requirement on testing, all travelers, testing on the second day, testing on the 12th day, and a restriction of entry to residents and Taiwanese citizens only. So they also perhaps implemented a little bit of a hybrid model that borrowed a little bit from the US-Canada model and also from the South Korea side to develop their own thing. In addition to, they were very much heavily digitally tech savvy. And that was very similar to the case of South Korea, identifying potential cases and mass use was very much what helped the country prevent the situation from getting any worse. New Zealand, a similar type of situation. I'm sure you've heard of the case of New Zealand many times. All travelers required to go into managed isolation and quarantine facilities for 14 days. And I think the 14-day emphasis is important because in the case of the CDC and the US recommendations about travelers coming into the US and how long they should quarantine or not quarantine, the guidelines have, I would say, relaxed a little bit. So originally it was 14 days, then it became 10 days, then it became 7 days, depending on how many times you get tested along the way, or whether or not you had tested negative, or where you were coming from before your arrival to the US. So I think those things are also important to consider. So I think what is also important for us to discuss now at this point in 2021 is what of the COVID-19 outbreak. So we had the COVID-19 outbreak, and then what? What has happened now? Now, originally you looked at quote unquote success case stories based on the number of infections, how you were able to control whether or not you had linear growth and exponential growth of infections happening throughout different countries. Now, what was very unfortunate was that the US was actually leading in a lot of the infection numbers, and we're still leading in many different ways. But I think ultimately what came to make the difference was at the plateau point where you have an increase of infections, but now being met with vaccinations. So vaccinations become important in displaying the global power dynamics, more importantly than even the COVID-19 outbreak. So if one would argue that the outbreak and how it was handled might have been more based on a case-by-case specific scenario of maybe countries that have had maybe a historic response to these infectious diseases, vaccinations ultimately depended on which countries were able to pour in the most amount of money and which countries were able to secure the most amount of vaccinations and actually have it delivered to their doorsteps. And I think that's also important. Securing it and having it delivered. And so what we have in terms of numbers, as you can see here, and this again is data from last week, which means that this also has to be updated. You can see that Israel is the country that is leading in terms of vaccinations, which is the reason why now they have no mask mandate and people are just hanging out without mask as if though returning to the normal times and enjoying life as usual. Now, in the case of Chile, you have here a vaccination record of 40%. But I think what becomes really important, and this is towards my last slides that I have coming up, is the type of also vaccines that you are also exposed to and the government's policy and response into making sure that people don't celebrate too early. So in the case of Chile, a lot of the people celebrated too early. Oh, vaccinations are coming, we are getting vaccinated. After one dose, people started going out and doing their own usual things. So that doesn't actually help in mitigating the levels of the spread of the disease, especially with COVID and the variants and the mutations that this disease can actually have, it becomes ever more important to actually abide by the guidelines of getting the second shot, waiting the 14 days for you to be able to build up your immunity, depending on the type of vaccine, right? I think Pfizer and Moderna are 1 week, but AstraZeneca and others are 14 days after the second shot. So that becomes also important to emphasize. The United States here, again, the reason why I emphasize that this is data from about a week ago, today, last I checked right before our presentation, the US currently has 54.2% of the population above the age of 18 having received at least 1 dose of the vaccine. So that is huge. That is very significant. In terms of a fully vaccinated population today, as of today, is 37.3%. So that those numbers, again, vary significantly from what you're seeing here. And this is data that I pulled from last week. So you can see that there's a massive rate of vaccinations happening. Some of these countries, I think you might be able to identify, and some of these countries might not actually make a lot of sense to you. Now, I think it's also important to consider the population size that you're looking at in terms of the countries and the vaccination percentage of the population. So take that also into consideration in examining this particular slide. Now, I think it becomes really interesting that you don't see Canada here, which is the reason why I mentioned how the power dynamics are actually going to even impact those countries that you might think are in the higher power gate, but in reality, this vaccination effort and the vaccine supply and demand and delivery has demonstrated that there's more of power dynamics at play that perhaps some of the countries that looked like they were very well prepared have not been able to fit into. So this is, again, another vaccination chart that you can see. These are the percentage of people that have been vaccinated. Again, this is a little bit older data, as I already mentioned before. Today, the numbers look a little bit different for the United States. But to get a very general idea, Israel still leading, Chile, one of the, I guess, only South American countries here. You can see United States among other countries here. Let me go to the next slide. These are the countries that are considered somewhat still to be vaccinating, I guess, their population, but at a very, very lower rate. You can see Brazil. Those numbers actually haven't changed that much for Brazil. Canada, those numbers are changing this week, actually. So up until last week, it wasn't changing, but this week it's changing. So a lot of turnover is happening. And France, you also see not a significant level of vaccination, but starting points of vaccinations also taking place. Let me skip over to another slide because I think this is what will become key. So these are what we call the G20 countries, the group of 20 countries, the group of 20 countries that are economically sound and politically also the power players within global politics. Now, out of these countries, some you have been able to identify as the countries that have been well into the course of vaccination, such as the United States. However, I don't believe you have seen Japan. I don't believe you have seen South Korea. And that was a case that we mentioned early on as a good case that perhaps did well in terms of prevention of COVID outbreak. And you also didn't see China being mentioned. Brazil was also not mentioned as a country that was leading in its vaccination. The UK was. So that's something also to consider. So what does that actually mean? I think we're looking at what we consider to be a vaccine war. And I know war in the traditional sense has to do with one state declaring war against the other, but think of this more in a metaphorical way. We are going through a vaccine war where in the case of the US, primarily the reason why they were able to secure so much vaccinations is because we have prevented the possibility of vaccine exports, primarily so that we can address what is happening here. In other words, US interests, right? You're looking at countries turning inside to look at what it is in their interest, in their best interest to secure the population to get vaccinated. The reason why I'm mentioning where these vaccines are being produced is because similar types of ideas are actually being also emphasized. In the case of Canada, which is one of the earliest countries to secure all the vaccine contracts from Moderna, Pfizer, and AstraZeneca, because Johnson & Johnson's, that wasn't a thing that they could actually sign on to at that time. In their case, even though they had all these contracts and secured, and they had even paid up, they were still unable to get a lot of the vaccines delivered on time, which is why Canada has been noted as the lagging model of vaccinations. And that had to do with, again, Europe turning on its own, looking at itself and trying to prioritize Europe's interest before that of other countries. And again, similar types of dynamics are done within the US or in the US, where you have the administration, Biden administration, actually continuing parts of the Trump administration agenda in terms of prioritizing American interests and American vaccinations first. What happens with this vaccine development and also vaccine shortages around the world is that you see countries trying to secure what is perhaps rightfully theirs, but to administer to their own population for their own political interests, because they also have future elections coming up and things like that, so that they can be not necessarily held accountable by their compatriots or their citizens about their performance in having at least allocated the vaccines for their population. So you see a Europe-centric, a US-centric model developing on the basis of vaccines. Now, how does Canada fit into this? Canada is one of those countries that fits into the first world, but that has basically lost the vaccine war because none of the plants that produce vaccines are located in Canada. Even if Canada has such a strong tie with Europe, and it has a very good relationship, in particular, Justin Trudeau has a very good relationship with Macron, who's the leader of France, it doesn't matter. At the end of the day, when one is trying to prioritize and deal with the pandemic and secure vaccinations or a solution for their own people, they're going to prioritize and look into their national interests. So we go back to a very state-centric model of looking at interests and what benefits me as a country versus others. Now, where does this leave the rest of the world? So we've been talking a lot about big countries and how they are able to do things and things like that. Here, what you actually see is a map of the countries that are COVAX committed. And COVAX is basically almost like a sharing pot, if you will, of countries that have basically donated different types of vaccine resources for people to be able, or for countries to be able to tap into. And the countries that are tapping into it are the countries that generally are from the global south or developing countries. So the countries that say AMC eligible are the ones that are going to be likely going to COVAX to get vaccines from. In the case of COVAX committed states, which includes Canada and Mexico, US is not committed to COVAX. What's interesting was at some point, because in the case of Canada, as I mentioned before, because they were running so short on vaccines, because they had lost on the power struggle with European countries, they started tapping on COVAX and saying, we're going to get what was rightfully ours because we donated the most amount of resources to this conglomeration of basically sharing vaccines or making it cheaper for everybody else. So they were going back, even though they were a developed country, to tap into the vaccine market. Now, what's very unfortunate is what will happen as a result of these vaccine wars happening. These are not, again, like the traditional wars that you have, but more in the metaphorical sense in a power struggle between countries, is that the losers are always going to be developing countries. This is the projection that you have from the BBC. This is from early on this year. The projections actually differ greatly monthly by monthly because the economists actually projected the world to go back to normal, especially developing countries, by 2022. But now you can see it was 2023. So it varies monthly by monthly. And this also has to do with vaccine production and also the rise of infections happening. So here you can see, according to this map, that we're looking at a normalization, quote unquote, of the world happening in 2022 or 2023 for developing countries. Unfortunately, in the case of India, it's likely going to take a longer time. India, another global power player, which has actually vowed to not export anymore and not provide any vaccines for COVAX because it is one of the main suppliers for COVAX. because of their situation that they are suffering. In other words, turning back inwards to focus on its national interest. And thereby, as a result of this process, who will end up losing are going to be developing countries that have from the beginning been suffering one way or the other a lot worse in a pandemic type of setting than cases such as the United States and other countries around the world. So I hope that gives you a little bit of a better idea in terms of disparities of power that have taken place as a result of COVID, and not only COVID response, but also as a result of the vaccine wars that have developed as a result or related to COVID. And here, what I haven't touched upon in this presentation are also the case of human rights, right? Once the vaccine actually comes in to these developing countries, depending on the levels of corruption that you have, you might actually see another disparity occurring within the states or within the countries and within the provinces and things such as that, where you might see more of an urban concentration of vaccine distribution that perhaps ought not to have been the case, but that does happen. And that has to do with the developing countries, corruption levels, and other lack of resources to be able to transport the vaccines to rural areas that are also going to impact the level of the casualties coming out from this situation. So I would leave it at that. Let me finish on this slide because I know this is also important for everyone to see. So let me mute myself, and Jim, you can take over, or
Thank you, Nusa. So yeah, we just have a little bit of information here if you want to find out more about the University of Baltimore. Up top, you can see the link to join our website, ubalt.edu, where you can get a bunch of information. Below that is the link to complete an application for the University of Baltimore. If you would like to complete an application with us in the next month, you can use this fee waiver code, GAHS21, all capital letters, and that will waive your application fee. And then this contact email at the bottom, if you send an email to that email for more questions, that will come directly to me, and I'll be happy to speak with you about our programs, the application process, the visa process, or any other questions you might have about coming to study with us. So we want to give you all a chance to ask questions if you have them, and that can be either about the application, but also if you have questions about the presentation that Nusa presented today.
Thank you so much, Jim and Nusa. And
yes, can we?
Yes, Sarita, go ahead. If we have questions, I think we can
Yes.
open the mic. Yeah.
Yes, yeah, that was my question. If we were supposed to ask, using the mic or write the questions.
I think you can go ahead and open your mic.
Okay, so I
Please.
think thank you, Nusa, for such a comprehensive
Yeah.
explanation about the vaccine in all the countries. I think from the international business perspective, I think it's very important. Yeah, especially if you are in either kind of business. My question is, what do you do with this kind of information in practical reasons when you talk to your students? For example, what kind of the actions? Because sometimes some scenarios are bright. Yes, some scenarios, for example, when you think about the fully vaccinated countries, and they are going to be to affect especially African countries and Asia, some Asian countries. Okay, so from the perspective of a student, of a graduate student, how do you think that this kind of information helps us in terms of practical measures? How can we students, I'm assuming a role as a student, as a graduate student, what can I do with such information?
Thank you so much, Areta, for the question. I think one of the, it's a frustrating situation, right? The position to be as a student oftentimes, because you start wondering, well, is there anything I can do to make a change? I think one of the most important things that has developed as a result of India going through a massive infection rate, massive death tolls that, unfortunately, I have to say this, are surmounting to the death tolls that were happening in Brazil. I'm sorry, I'm trying to be careful and sensitive about the situation in Brazil, but India's situation is probably going to even spiral out of control. What you actually see is countries, or Biden, the Biden administration in the US, deciding to finally share some of its basic raw materials that will be needed for further vaccine production. So what can you do as a student? I think urge governments to basically open up the possibility for these vaccine raw productions to happen in other countries, share information, and actually develop more of a global type of response for pandemic rather than country-based responses to the pandemic, because I think people forget the word pandemic means that this is going to have an impact everywhere. But I think they're still approaching this in the basis of, that's why I emphasize the different models that each country was using. You cannot just have your own model. It doesn't work that way anymore. We're too globally intertwined. I'm not saying that that's a bad thing. That has brought us many different positive things. But because we are so globally connected, there is also a necessity for us to think about global responses in this case. And I know at the moment, in the case of the US and other countries, they are prioritizing to try to handle the response that's coming in, to try to vaccinate its own population. But I think they forget, and I think this is something that I keep wondering about as well, that Israel, for instance, that is fully vaccinated, people are going out and having a great time. And you see, students from Brazil, from other countries of the world, a little bit in awe and a little bit envious that, oh, those people over there are having such a good time, or maybe I need to travel if I'm a wealthy Brazilian to Europe to get vaccinated, or I'll travel to the UAE, that's a hot spot that people like to go to get vaccinated. Or I know for a fact that elites from many different South American countries come to the US to get vaccinated so that they can enjoy a normal life. That's great. But it also, if you are, a graduate student or just a regular student sitting in the middle of, having an internet connection at a public parking space and trying to manage your studies, it seems like a very unfair world. At some point that catches up. At some point, that kind of disparity that people start feeling in terms of the haves and have-nots, that catches on. So students need to be more proactive, I think, in the things that they can do in demanding the government, whether it's by Twitter. I know that social media does have an influence at the end, because transnational advocacy networks, the pressure from the world does make a difference. So maybe pressuring governments to do better. In the case of Brazil, I have also very personal connections because my husband is Brazilian, so we haven't been able to visit Brazil for a long time now. So the government also needs to be more emphasizing on the fact that this is a pandemic. And if I were perhaps a policymaker, and this is something that students can also strategize in terms of thinking about what policy developments can be made, perhaps even just a Southern Cone-based response to the pandemic, where there's collaboration between Argentina or between countries that are getting a lot of the Sinovac and Sinopharm vaccines. I know Sinopharm, which is the Chinese vaccine that has been distributed in Chile. I know in the case of Brazil, it's Sinovac, right? So maybe more collaboration, because I know University of Sao Paulo is heavily involved in the development of vaccines. Maybe more collaboration. Is there anything more that can be done so that we can globally end this sooner, which can happen? And to do that, you have to urge these first world countries to please share. As much as capital interests are great, but this is not about, I guess maybe I'm too much of an idealist in that way, Areta, because I keep thinking about all those innocent people that died for no reason. And as a professor, I guess I would like students to believe in the possibility of change. And I have seen the possibility of change. through social media. That does happen. So maybe that might be a way, perhaps, to look at the situation.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. I think these were the words I were expecting you to hear. I teach international business students, and I also teach law students. And I know that those two fields have been, as you said, we have to have positive attitude. And I also agree with you. And what can we learn from that? What changes can we implement to make a better world? Thank you.
Thank you, Areta. Thank you, Nusa. Yeah, you were giving us a lot of food for thought, as we say, right? To reflect on the big picture of those numbers, looking into a world perspective, right? Because, of course, each country would see their own problems, their internal problems and struggles. But we know this is beyond our borders. We know every day, I know, but we have challenges on so many levels, right? Thank you. That was very comprehensive, as Areta said. Anybody else who have any questions, please? Okay. There is one from Isabella here. As a student losing my second year of high school, I can only say that it is difficult seeing the situation in the country, not being sure of the future. Well, Isabel, I think you should be more optimistic. I think you have the world ahead of you, right? I don't know if Yusta wants to say a few words to Isabella, but
Sure.
yeah.
I think you're not alone. You're not alone. Many of our
Exactly.
students, actually, even at the undergraduate level, because University of Baltimore, we had to transition to a fully online system. I have many students who have emailed me that they don't know if they can continue because it's not the same. It's not the same to be studying with a professor in a room versus being online fully, and you have to suddenly adjust things, right? Universities, well, ours was, thankfully, we were very well prepared to transition online, but not every university had the means to be able to do that effectively. In high schools and elementary schools and middle schools, it's very difficult for students to grapple with something that seems so virtual and an enemy that you cannot see, an invisible enemy, which has become this COVID outbreak, because it seems surreal. It seems like it's not really happening, but it is. You see the death. You know someone that knows someone that has been infected, and this is affecting us in so many levels. So if you feel a little bit of despair, that's okay. That's okay to feel despair. I feel despair many times. I'm sure my colleague Jim feels despair many times. But at the same time, as Areta said, we need to have this perhaps more positive outlook. Maybe this is a very good moment for global activism, right? Student activism. High school students are very good at organizing on social media. Activism, continue to speak up. Start a hashtag regarding maybe more increased mask usage or increased vaccination efforts, or that there needs to be more transparency in how vaccines are distributed. I know that's the case. So I'm partly South Korean and partly Peruvian. I know in the case of Peru, we've had what we call vacuna gate. We've had multiple issues with vaccines coming in and politicians and high-level people getting vaccinated on their own. So transparency in government and things such as that's something I think that high school students can really do a better job than even me. I'm still not good at Twitter, but Isabella, I'm sure you probably can figure that out at a better rate than somebody like me.
Yeah, but I would say also when you were at this point, at this age, and finishing high school, and you were still deciding your career, I would say this would be a very good moment to look into all the new possibilities that are coming out of this crisis, because for any crisis, you have opportunities. And that includes change in the career scenario. And let's say public health, and it's the public health field, or the health in general, right? Health fields are fantastic. And you see, if, for instance, if you are interested in research, you have a lot ahead of you, you know, in terms of new fields that you can explore, or political science, thank you, Arieta, or international relations, in business itself, right? And entrepreneurship. You have, yes, international law. So, and things are now, you know, the interdisciplinary approach is showing that you can start in, you know, with the basics and then decide a more specific field in the future. So I know this is a challenge for schools, for educators. You know, everything is transitioning to different models, teaching models, learning models, and a work scenario too, right? A working setting is changing because we are now in a home office situation that you have to be more productive just virtually. So there is so much going on. But for someone that is leaving high school and you have all those fields ahead, right? It's fantastic, I think. You don't need to decide right now, but look at all this transformation that is going on and see how, you know, in what area you identify yourself to start pursuing an academic path and then a career, right? So this is a great session to provoke that reflection in students. So thank you so much, Nusta. And I think we don't have any specific questions about admissions here, but it's wonderful that we now know that Jim is there and he is knowledgeable about international applications, which has some peculiarities that are, you know, you need to really know about them to navigate the process. And we are glad we can reach you out. And Nusta, you also, I'm sure, will be reachable for students. So thank you again. And I think we can close here. And we will leave the recording available, as I said, including to people that will reach us and ask for that. Or we have our video library on the website. So we'll have that as a special session because of the topic. I'm sure we'll have viewers there. All right. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Have a wonderful afternoon. Stay safe and healthy, everyone. Bye.